listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
We are here. We only went and smashed 300 episodes of this show, the Straight to Video podcast. Now, I don't know about you, but the last 4 years have flown by, but it's been an amazing ride so far. Not only reconnecting with a bunch of old friends, but meeting so many new and cool people along the way who've shared their stories, along with a whole slab of retro gold memories. Today's show marks that big 300 in style. It's a great mashup of movies and music as I speak to actor Zach Galligan. I consider the year 1984 to be a really important year for me as a movie fan. Two of my all-time favourite films, two perfect films in my opinion, were both released on the very same day, June the 8th, 1984 in America. One was Ghostbusters and the other was Gremlins. I saw both of them a bunch of times during my summer in Vicksburg, Mississippi, each time with my sister Andrea, and I could not wait for them to hit cinemas in the UK when I got back home just to see them all over again. Zach, of course, played Billy Peltzer in Gremlins and its chaotic, over-the-top sequel a few years later. He's also starred in the Waxwork films and also played a part in Adam Green's awesome Hatchet franchise of horror movies, appearing in Part 3 of the Victor Crowley saga. As you'll hear, he is also a massive music fan, and I'm talking music encyclopedia level of different genres, and lived and worked right in the heart of some of the coolest times for rock and roll, which you'll hear all about during our chat. He's also a simply great storyteller. This Straight to Video podcast, along with all others, is proudly presented to you in association with Affinity Photo, an incredible piece of photo editing software which I've been using for graphic design the past couple of years. Affinity Photo is used to create the podcast episode art where you see each and every week, and it's an extremely affordable alternative to other programs on the market, so please, if that's your thing, check them out at affinity.serif.com. Alright, let's do this. I want to shout to my friend Dominic Burns for helping make this episode happen and hooking me up with Zach. He doesn't do a lot of podcasts, so for him to take the time for this one is super cool. Dom said we'd have a lot to talk about when it came to music, and he was right on the money. But there's a lot of other cool stuff in this conversation, so please sit back and enjoy episode 300 of my Straight to Video podcast and my chat with Zach Galligan. With the Thing poster in the background, it's fantastic. It's already a win.
There you go.
I think I read you got that signed. That was one of your very few fanboy moments.
Yeah, that's John Carpenter right there. And then about 6 other members of the cast. Obviously, no Kurt Russell.
Still to be added.
As Lemmy of Motorhead used to say, you can't have everything. Where would you put it?
There you go. So how are you? Good to see you.
I'm doing good.
If you don't mind, I'd love for you to take us back to growing up in New York City and being a kid during the very late 60s and through the 70s. I mean, being from the UK, a lot of us have like fascinations with old school America, and that must have been an incredible time in that environment. Did you actually live in Manhattan, or was you like upstate New York?
I was born and raised in Manhattan. I was born in a hospital called Mount Sinai, which is around 97th, 98th, and 5th Avenue, but literally off Central Park. I grew up from 0 to 8. I was at 120 Riverside Drive, which is right on the Hudson River. And then I moved a couple of blocks over to a larger apartment. I didn't. My mom did. From when I was 8 until I was 20, I lived on 86th Street between Riverside and West End. So I was an Upper West Side kid. I went to school at 77th and Broadway. That was only about 10 blocks, half a mile away. I mean, basically 70s New York, what you see in Taxi Driver was basically, my home. It's funny because it's hard for me to watch Taxi Driver. There are certain shots when he's driving through Times Square. Scorsese does this kind of a trick where he shot it through a one-way mirror out of a van. So he's shooting the streets, but nobody sees that he's shooting them. So everybody's acting naturally and normally. And so that's why it looks so, that's why nobody's staring and looking at the camera. And that's very documentary style.
Yeah, so there's no extras or anything like that. That is New York.
Yeah, there are no extras. He's just shooting the streets. There are a couple of places, like there's one arcade place called Playland that's in the movie. There's a very short shot of it. And when I see that shot, I kind of get a little PTSD because that was a very rough arcade. And if you went in there and didn't sort of have, shall we say, the right swagger about you, you would have suddenly a bunch of very friendly people on either sides of your shoulders watching you play the game and then asking you if you had any additional orders.
What was the hot game?
Well, you got to remember, I mean, you're talking the 70s. This is pre-Space Invaders. So you had really old school games. One of them was called something like Shark Attack or Shark Hunt. And if shark comes towards you, you have a little spear gun. You would shoot and you'd hit the shark with the spear gun and it would go. It was kind of gross. You get hit with the spear and it would bleed and it would go blue, 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 like that. And then you had very, very embryonic versions of what became pole position, the F1 racing game. So you had racing games. You had like Duck Hunt. You had a lot of those earlier games until 78 when you got Space Invaders, and around 80, 81, that's when you started getting the really good ones like Pac-Man, Millipede, Williams Defender.
Did you have a game of choice?
I would go through phases. I was obsessed with certain games for certain years. So for like summer of 1981, when I was 17, there was a game called Tempest. You would go down this long tube and there would be spikes along the tube. You'd have to avoid the tube and these things would come up and try and get you. And it was absolutely so frustrating. Then I went through a Galaga period that was huge, but eventually I settled on, and my all-time favorite game probably is Defender. Absolutely loved Defender.
It's a pretty fast-moving game for back then, Defender was, from what I remember.
Yeah. And then you have to shoot the green things and then catch the people before they hit the surface. And then once you lose all the people, the ground below you goes away and you're trapped in this horrible space nightmare with all of these buzzing creatures coming after you. It's horrendous, but I absolutely loved it. I must have spent in the early 80s the equivalent of thousands of dollars on video games. And of course, your readers don't know this, or your listeners rather, but I just finished about 2 weeks ago a book about the making of Gremlins, about basically the entire making of Gremlins, from my first few auditions to booking the part to rehearsing it, flying to LA for the first time, the culture shock, working with Phoebe, learning to train with the dog, the special effects, the explosions, everything. And then all the way through shooting the movie, coming home, dealing with the return to reality, Warner Brothers doing nothing with the movie until finally they have this one breakthrough test screening that makes them believe it's going to be a hit. And then all of a sudden, with only 2 months to go, they start pushing and pushing and pushing it. And the movie comes out of nowhere, as we all know. And instead of getting blown out the June 8th weekend by Ghostbusters, which everyone thought it was going to be like, Ghostbusters will make $20 million and Gremlins would be lucky to make 9. They thought it was going to be just a drubbing. It ended up being 16 to 15. They beat us by like just $1 million. And then the next week, both of us, which is almost unheard of, improved by, I think, 11% on the next weekend in the same number of theaters. So instead of it dipping, it went up.
Well, I think you've said before, it's almost like lightning in a bottle, that they were both so popular that if one was sold out, people would go and see the other one.
There was so much buzz on both of them that it was really crazy. It really was, 84 was really the Gremlins, Ghostbusters, Purple Rain summer. I'm leaving out Temple of Doom just because people don't really remember, but Temple of Doom was sort of seen as a bit of a disappointment when it came out. The first Indiana Jones was such a classic and so much fun. And the Temple of Doom actually had sort of a grim atmosphere to it. In fact, Spielberg himself has said he doesn't really care for the tone of the movie. He thinks it's too kind of dark.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, well, it might be your favorite, but I mean, it was considered, it gets the lowest rating of the first 3, I believe. And yeah, so the book is done. And in it, I tell, when I got there, Spielberg was gone shooting the Temple of Doom. But Mike Fennell, the producer of Gremlins, was like, Steven extends the invitation for you to walk over to his office and just play his video games. He had a whole room full of stand-up video games.
Yeah, you're expecting little handheld ones, and there's like the full stack.
So he had 4 of them. He had Food Fight, which was this game, a sort of obscure game now, where you used to run across the screen as you were like a chef, and you would throw pies at obstacles and try and get to the other side of the screen. So he had Food Fight, he had Missile Command, he had Millipede, and he had Pole Position. And I would always obsessively play the Millipede machine. And I guess somewhere along the way, Mike Fennell and Joe Dante got wind of that. So as a way of saying thank you to me for doing the movie, they talked to Spielberg about it and they sent me the Millipede machine to my apartment.
No shit. To a New York apartment, or was you living out in LA? Then?
Yeah, no, towards the New York apartment. So they shipped it all the way across the country. I'm sitting in my kitchen in my apartment that I grew up in. And we had two doors. We had a front door by the front elevator, and then there was a sort of a back door by a freight elevator in case they needed to bring, really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I'm sure if someone wanted a piano in their apartment, they'd use the freight elevator, and somehow try and squeeze it through the door. So there was a buzz in the back door, which is almost never happens. You'd get 2 or 3 freight elevator buzzes a year. And, the front door had like a kind of a happy one, and the back door had like a frang. So I'm sitting there and I hear like this great elevator buzz, and I'm like, what on earth is that? And there's this guy, and he's like, are you Galligan? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I got a delivery for you. And so he brings it in and unwraps it. And I saw it was the millipede machine. I was like, oh my God. Funniest thing was that my mom came home a little later. I put it in the kitchen, sees this. I thought my mom's going to hit the roof, sees the huge millipede machine, comes in and is like, my late mother's no longer alive. She's like, what on earth is that? And I'm like, it's a millipede machine. So she started to learn how to play it. And literally within a month, my mom was incredible. She got like millions. She would have scores. You would just look and it would just say, mom, 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 all the way down. Some of her scores were like 4, 5, 6 million. She could play literally sometimes. She got good enough so she could play 45 minutes to an hour in a single game. She was phenomenal. It was ridiculous.
Mom, when's dinner? Forget it. I'm about to hit the high score.
Exactly. She's like, I'm on my way through all the mushrooms.
What happened to that game? Did it die a death?
So you have to realize this. There was no eBay until 1998. I got the game in 1984. That's a 14-year gap. There was no internet.
Them things are big and heavy as well.
Big and heavy. So we finally shipped it up to my sister's house, upstate New York, just to keep it. And we had it until about 91 or 2. And the tubes and the picture, everything started going. When you play a game like that with no upkeep. So eventually we didn't know what to do or how to replace the tube or anything like that. So we junked it.
Steven Spielberg's millipede game.
Yeah, but you see, here's the thing. I don't think it was his actual machine from his studio. I think they just bought. But yeah, I would have been a Joe Dante millipede machine. It would have been worth something, But what are you going to do? We didn't know it was going to retain any kind of value.
It got well used anyway, by your mum at least.
It certainly did.
Music is something that's played a massive role in your life, particularly from having an older sister who would introduce you to a lot of bands. But wasn't it your dad that took you to buy your very first vinyl album of Abbey Road?
Yeah, on Broadway near 84th Street, there was a shoe store he used to take me to. It was called Indian Walk. Not a very PC title nowadays. It had a picture of a Native American walking past a field or something like that. But you got to remember, it's 1969. So Indians, as they were called then, or Native Americans, as they're called now, there was a lot of awareness being raised for it. So my mom, for whatever reason, you've got to remember, I'm 5. I'm a kindergartner. My mom would put me and dress me in moccasins, like Native American moccasins, leather moccasins. It's the 60s. Don't ask. You know what I mean? There were so many trends and weird things in the 60s made no sense. And right next to Indian Walk was Record Store. And I went in one time and was looking at the stuff, but all of the racks were too high for me because I'm only at 5 years old, I'm probably about 4 feet. I'm a little kid. All I can say is that I remember the first time I remember purchasing something, there was Abbey Road. They would have these wire racks that would be on the side of, they'd have all of the record racks. And then on corners, they'd have these wire racks with new albums, like new album year, And so it was the top wire rack. So my dad just had to pick me up a few inches, pick me up like 6 inches so I could reach the wire rack and pull it out of the wire rack. And I can remember being 5 years old and walking with the Abbey Road album up to the register and having to hand it up to the register was up there. You know what I mean? You had to hand it up to the guy and pay for it. And it was something like, seriously, back then it was something like $3.99, $2.99. Something like that.
An original Abbey Road vinyl, one of the first pressings.
Yeah. And so we got that and took it home. And of course, as a kid at 5, there were only 2 songs that I played over and over again, drove my mom crazy. And that was Maxwell's Silverhammer, which is very much a kid's song, and Octopus's Garden, which is the ultimate Beatles kid song. So I can remember I was so terrible with the needle, the diamond needle. I would put it down on the record player and it would always go,
trying to get the gap in between the songs.
Trying to get the gap between the, and when you're 5, your coordination's pretty bad. At least mine was. So I can remember finally getting it on Octopus's Garden and they would go, I'd like to be under the sea. And I can remember being 5, like dancing around, like you ever see little kids dancing around just all free and completely unconcerned about anything? That was me. Nice summer of 1969, just dancing around in my room, 5 years old, to Beatles. not knowing that they had just broken up and had probably done their last recording session in August of that year.
You lived in New York till you was like 20. At what point was you aware of New York being like this rich hotbed of massive music talent, especially during the 70s? Bands like the Ramones and Blondie and all that kind of thing blowing up out there.
Well, it's weird because I tell people some of these stories and everything is so different now. People don't believe it. But like, I was pretty much allowed in the 70s to go out by myself, even though I was 11 or 12, and take cabs places. So I would be, during the day within reason. My father had moved down to Alexandria, Virginia, which is right by Washington, D.C. So I would go visit my dad. And this is what I would do. People never believe it, but I swear to you, I did it for years. I'd come downstairs in front of my apartment. I would hail a cab. I would go in the cab by myself with my bag to LaGuardia Airport, get out at the Eastern Airlines shuttle, walk into the shuttle thing. I had my mom's credit card. They did with those little things. Remember these things that went sliding things?
You get the dodgy receipts.
Giant receipts. I would buy my own ticket. It was something like $52 round trip on the shuttle from New York to Washington, D.C. National Airport. I would go through security. It was just a metal detector, right? There was no security like post 9/11. Go through the metal detector. And then I would go and I would sit usually in the first row. The stewardess, now they're called flight attendants, but at the time they were called stewardesses. And the stewardess would say, "Are you flying by yourself?" And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Let's put you here." So they would put me in like the first row. And the stewardess would take me off when I landed. And when I landed, I would come right down the jetway. And before 9/11, you could wait for the person at the end of the jetway, not when you got down to the baggage claim. Now it's very different. So my stepmom or my dad would be waiting at the end of the thing. So I was going to the airport and flying to DC when I was 11 years old by myself. So going around to concerts was really a question of affording them. So the first concert I ever went to was at Madison Square Garden. It was October of 1978, and it was Jethro Tull.
Dude.
Jethro Tull, he was on his Bursting Out tour. And then the following year, I also went to Tull again. I was a Tull fanatic. I saw the Stormwatch tour. Starting in 78 is when I started going to concerts. So I saw Boston with Prague group called UK opening for them at the Nassau Coliseum. And I also saw, this was a good one, the Cars at Woolman's Ice Skating Rink in Central Park with a great new wave group called The Records opening for them.
There's so many of those like new wave groups, which I've never heard of, but I know if I heard them, I'd love them. There's so many great names.
Yeah, The Records had the big hit with a song called Starry Eyes. Keep me out of your starry eyes and be on your way. It's a great song. I love that. I was a super new wave kid. I loved the Cars. I loved new wave. I thought they were the coolest.
Did you like Kiss being from New York?
Obsessed with Kiss. There was a comic book store. It had a really, really weird name. I'll get it in a second. Anyway, I went there the day that the Kiss comic book that was printed with their blood in it. I got that the day it came out.
Who was your guy in Kiss?
I was kind of into the Ace face. I liked Ace Frehley. And I liked Gene Simmons too. I don't know. There's something about Paul Stanley, his whole kind of like, "Hey, everybody, how you doing out there tonight?" It sounded phony to me even back then. Even at 10, I was like, he doesn't mean it. But yeah, if you really want a funny Gremlins tie-in with Kiss, in like 2018, Corey Feldman was playing with his band, the Corey and his Angels. And he's like, "Hey, man, I'm in town. You want to introduce the band?" And so just for shits and giggles, I thought it'd be great. So I went and I introduced Corey. And when I came out, I did the introduction from Kiss Alive. I went, "You wanted the best and you got it. The hottest band of the land, Corey and the Angels." And place went nuts. It was hilarious. And it was ridiculous too, because they were not as good as Kiss. No offense. And then, of course, no one can ignore Grateful Dead. I saw the Grateful Dead at Madison Square Garden Labor Day weekend. That's September 4th. Yeah, September 4th, 1979. Great show. I was 15. I think I bought some cheap weed illegally outside Madison Square Garden. You had to get a little bit stoned. I went with this really cute girl named Sherry Geffner from my camp. And there was no opening act. It's just the Dead. No opening act for the Dead.
I love it. When did movies become an important part of your life? Because I think you've said you saw Star Wars on the day of release as a teenager in 77. How was the impact of that film compared to anything you'd previously seen?
Well, Star Wars was a real game changer just because I did see it on the opening day, opening show, again on 86th Street. I had to take the crosstown. It was across the park. I can't remember the name of the theater, but it was right next to a department store that was open for years called Gimbel's. I remember going and seeing it, and quite honestly, the word of mouth was not 100% there. The first show, I think, was like 2/3 full.
That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It was not packed. But when the movie started, it is impossible nowadays, because the effects are so great now. It is impossible to describe to someone nowadays the impact of that opening shot of that endless ship coming over. It's like from the up, as you just pans down to the planet and that ship goes, and you see the bottom of the ship and it goes on and on and on and on. And then finally you see the engines all lit with the roar of the engines like that. And after that first shot, I was like this, I am in. And then one of the craziest things that I still remember from movies is they do the thing that blow down the wall and Darth Vader steps through. The second he stepped through, all dressed in black, as if it was like programmed in our DNA, everybody in the movie theater hissed at Darth Vader. It was like we recognized that he was evil right away. And what was so strange was this was the 70s and moral ambiguity was a big thing. You'd go see movies, you'd be like, who's the hero? Who's the villain? Like in 1974, there's this movie called The Parallax View with Warren Beatty. He's the hero. Guess what? At the end, he dies. Sorry, spoiler, but it's like there's all that kind of anti-hero, unhappy ending stuff that was going on all through the 70s because of Vietnam. Everyone was like, there are no happy endings. And that's when really Rocky and Star Wars in a 1-year period changed it around forever. And basically, till December of 1976, everyone was like, there's no such thing as a happy ending. From Christmas of 1976 to now, it's been nothing but happy endings. Nothing.
Everyone could finally cheer in the theater again.
Everyone could finally cheer in the theater. We cheered for Rocky. I saw that in the theater. That was incredible. Although I'll tell you, here's something surprising for you. Guess what movie I saw had the absolute largest, most insane fan reaction I've ever seen in my life, especially with regards to laughter. I could barely hear the screen. I'll give you a hint. Came out in 1999.
Go on. I'm pretty good with 80s films, but 90s are a bit of a gray area.
South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. Okay? What? The movie starts and they have an opening sort of show tune spoof. And they get to the second song, which I don't know. Is this G-rated?
No, go for it. You're fine.
Yeah. So the second song is called Uncle Fucker. You know that song?
Yeah.
And Terrence and Phillip in it, and they do a little tap dancing thing, when instead of tap dancing, they have farting sounds that are like tap dancing. The theater I saw it at in Santa Monica, I moved to LA at that time. When I saw that, I thought by the 10-minute mark, I thought the roof of the theater was going to blow off. People were losing their shit. I've never to this day heard laughter that loud. And I was almost crying. When you're in a room full of everybody pissing themselves, you're almost crying too.
Yeah, it's infectious.
It calmed down after that, but I will never forget that first 10 or 15 minutes of that South Park movie. It was like an atom bomb going off in the theater. It was crazy.
Is that a combination of it just being really good and really funny and just like people are like, holy shit, I can't believe they're doing this?
Yeah, I think the audacity of it, the filthiness of it, combined with how absurd it looks. The animation is deliberately terrible. It's just the little kids with these foul mouths. There was something really subversive about it. I think people were just kind of, I don't know, I think a lot of movies had been sort of playing it safe. And this was just decided to go, fuck it, and just go for it.
Of all the films, it's South Park. Amazing. Yeah. Gremlins is often listed as your first main movie role, but prior to that, you'd shot a film with comedy royalty in the form of Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd called Nothing Lasts Forever. I don't think people here in the UK understand how big something like Saturday Night Live was and is over in the US. So to be on set with like two giants from that show must have been pretty mind-blowing. So how was it getting off the mark alongside names like that?
When something's big in Britain, I'm sure it's very huge. But when something's big in America, it's just going to be orders of magnitude larger just because, you know, you guys have 60 million people. We have 350 million people. So, you know, something like Taylor Swift in the United States now is just mental. It's very hard. I mean, Beatlemania is like, you know, comes close to it. I mean, we had Beatlemania here too. I mean, America freaked out over the Beatles just as hard. My God, in San Francisco, the whole reason why the Beatles stopped touring is because after their show at Candlestick Park in 1966, they loaded the Beatles into trucks, you know, to get them out safely. And the fans all knew they were going into the armored cars. And they almost tipped over an armored car to try and get to them. And that's when George Harrison pulled the plug and said, look, this is madness. We're putting ourselves, we're borderline getting killed here. But what was I talking about? I lost my train of thought.
Saturday Night Live.
So, I mean, these guys were so huge. They had basically been on television for 5 years and had become an American institution. And they were then peeling off and starting to do movies. And Belushi and Aykroyd were obviously a team, John Belushi and Aykroyd, and Bill Murray was also doing very, very well. Those were the three that were really doing well. Gilda Radner wasn't doing well, Lorraine Newman, Garrett Morris, a lot of the other ones, Jane Curtin, not so much. They do TV and stuff like that. But those were the big three. And all three of them were going to be in the movie. John Belushi passed away a month before shooting. Actually, about 6 weeks before shooting, which is still one of the great, missed opportunities for me, and obviously incredibly sad for everyone who loved him and knew him. I mean, forget about me. The impact it had on Aykroyd was obviously enormous. So it was a weird movie to do because I was only 18. I was doing my first movie. And now I'm working with Murray and Aykroyd literally 2 months after one of their best friends has passed away. So it's kind of a shame because there was a bit of a pall.
Because they knew he should have been on set as well, I guess.
Should have been on set. And Tom Schiller, the director, was great friends with him. He gave his wife a cameo in the movie. His wife's in the movie. So that's kind of weird. But anyway, what's so strange about it is looking back, I'm 18 at the time. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I said to myself, I never really knew or paid attention to. I wonder how old Aykroyd and Murray were when they did that movie when I was working with them. And to my absolute shock and amazement, when I worked with Dan Aykroyd, I was 18 and Aykroyd was 29. Dude wasn't even 30.
Unreal.
Unfucking real. He seemed so much older and more mature than me. He had a mustache. Ironically, I expected him to be more kind of upset about everything, but he's Canadian, and a lot of the Canadian spirit is just like, well, got to keep a stiff upper lip and look on the bright side and be cheerful. And, if you know a lot of Canadian people, they tend to be pretty optimistic and cheerful. And so the very first time I met him, I knew he was on set. And we were shooting in this very strange studio up in Harlem called Filmways. It's where they shot The Midnight Cowboy. And they since have torn it down and converted it into a giant grocery store. In fact, for a long time, just to save money, they called it Foodways. So they could just get rid of the ILM and put it in OOD and make it Foodways. So I was walking around and I got lost in the studio and I walked into a locker room. For some reason, Aykroyd was in there and he was changing into his wardrobe. Maybe they didn't have a dressing room for him. It was a low budget movie. Even though it was a Saturday Night Live sponsored movie, it still had a very small budget, like $2.5 million, which is basically like 7 or 8 million now. And he's getting changed and he was in his costume and he had everything on except his shoes and socks. So I walked in and I said something like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he goes, "Hey there, aren't you Zach?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Hey, we're going to be doing a scene together." He goes, "Hey, I'm Danny." I go, "Hey, Danny, how are you?" And he goes, "Good." And then he immediately slipped into kind of like a Saturday Night Live type voice. And he said, "I do not know whether you know this or not, but I am Canadian and I am in fact a mutant." And he held up his fingers and he had webs between his fingers. I don't know if you know this. He has small webbings. He goes, "I am in fact a mutant containing webbed fingers and toes." And then he sort of held his foot up a little bit. And I could see he had small webs in his toes too, which is really strange. But I'll never forget him sort of introducing himself as a mutant.
As a mutant.
Yeah. And so he was great. I guess he just decided, maybe, who knows, maybe he saw it coming. When you have a friend who's really abusing drugs, a lot of times you kind of see it coming. So maybe he prepared for it for a while. He was in a great mood. And then Murray was very, very different, very hit or miss, depending on the day that you saw him. So he would alternate in a very confusing way to me because I'm only 18 and I don't have a whole lot of experience with people and especially with adults, When you're 18, you don't really have a ton of experience with adults, just your relatives. And some days he would be great. And then other days he would just be like terrible to me. And I was like, what is going on? Now, in the movie, he plays my enemy. He plays my nemesis. So I think what he was trying to do was, he had done Meatballs and Stripes and was just doing a brand new movie with Dustin Hoffman called Tootsie. He was like hot and on the upswing. And I think he saw that I was like this, I was like, wow, Bill Murray, SNL, he's awesome. And he was like, I think he wanted to demystify himself. Have me actually go like, he's kind of a dick. So that way, when I played scenes where we had to be hostile to each other, I wasn't in awe of him.
Did it work?
It did work. So good for him. But what's crazy is at the time, he was only 33.
It's unreal.
It's crazy. Aykroyd's 29, Murray's 33. And now that I'm 60, those are super young men. They're so young.
I used to spend summer vacations in the USA, and my sister and I, we both went to see Gremlins and Ghostbusters numerous times that summer at the Battlefield Mall in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Even though I recall going to the cinema a lot of times prior to then, I think that summer and those two films are the ones that really put a mark on my early cinema trips. What I found out recently, though, is that you were actually on set for Ghostbusters back in New York.
Yeah, well, it was pure coincidence. I went to a college in New York City called Columbia University, and I was going on my way just to my normal classes. I just finished Gremlins, so that would make it September, October of 1983. And so I was back at school and trying to go back to sort of like a normal life after an incredible experience. I'd maybe been back for 6 weeks. And I was on my way to Schermerhorn Hall, which is where I had history class. And as I'm walking along, I see this big white hearse in the middle of the main square near Low Library, which is the center of the mall at the very center of Columbia University. And leaning against it are these two guys from a distance, just in these like jumpsuits, holding these giant things. And on the side of the car is a ghost with a red circle and a slash through it. I'm like, what the heck is this? So I go down to take a look, and you could see them setting up cameras and this and that, whatnot, and putting up the police barriers, the blue sawhorses, police barriers to keep the crowds away and stuff like that. So I go down and I said, what's going on? And, the kids are like, they're shooting a movie. I'm like, who is there? They're like, it's Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd of Saturday Night Live. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's cool. And then all of a sudden I had to go, hey, wait a second. I know them. For a second, it was like, oh, the TV people. Oh, wait, I've broken that barrier. I've worked with them. And it's funny because they were sort of looking around. I guess they were in between shots or something like that. So I pushed myself up to the front of the barriers and I'm waving to them and waving. Most of the other kids are just standing there like this, like in awe. They wouldn't dare to do that. But I'm going like, hey, Billy, hey, Danny, like that. And Aykroyd looks over, sees me, and then he says something to Murray. And Murray had his back to me and turns around, looks at me. I can see this. It's 41 years ago, but it's like it happened 10 minutes ago. He squints his eyes, looks at me, and there's a line in Nothing Lasts Forever where he says, I keep getting him into trouble. And every time I get him into trouble, he keeps going, it's the kid, like figuring out that I'm the one who's fucking him over. He looks over and he sees me and he goes, it's the kid, like that. And he goes, come on over. So I go under the sawhorse. And as I take a couple of steps, the cops come over and they're like, sorry, young man, you can't. And Aykroyd comes over and he goes, it's okay, officer. It's all right. He's with us.
Oh, man. That's like the best validation ever.
I walk over with two of them to the Ghostbusters car. I'm leaning against the hearse with my backpack. I'm late for class, but who gives a fuck? I'm talking to them. They're like, what's going on? At this point, Aykroyd's 31 because he's born July 1st. So yeah, so it would have been, he would turn 30 in July. Yeah, so he's 31. He's like, hey man, I heard you were Steven. How was that? I go, yeah, it was great. He was cool. I only met him towards the end. He was in Sri Lanka a lot, this and that. He's like, yeah. And Murray was like, oh yeah, I want to work for Spielberg one day too. This and that. I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they explained it to me, and I'm just leaning up against the Ghostbusters mobile. And, nobody knew what it was. The movie hadn't come out yet. Nobody knew what it was. So I chatted with them maybe 5 minutes, 6 minutes, something like that. And then I said, all right, well, I got to go to class and I'm late. They're like, all right, yeah, we got to shoot too. Take care. It's great to see you, and did a little handshaking like that. And Murray yelled something to me sarcastically. I can't remember what it was, but I was like, okay, as I was walking away. And I walked back. And if you could have seen the look on all of the school kids, all my fellow pupils, the look on their face as I kind of walked back with my backpack and was like, excuse me. And I went underneath the sawhorses and the kids parted like I was Moses and they were the Red Sea. And I just came out the other side of the sawhorse and just went to my class. It's really one of the great moments of my life. It was the only time, because I didn't live on campus. It was the only time that I went to Columbia. I went there for 3 out of 4 years. The only time when I was like BMOC, big man on campus. The rest of the time, I was barely there and I was taking classes and writing papers and going off to do other films and stuff like that. But yeah, that was an incredible experience.
I love that. Growing up in New York, how was it for you like coming out to Hollywood? Was Gremlins your first time out on the West Coast?
I'd never been west of Colorado. The first day that I landed in Los Angeles, my agent picked me up at the airport and took me to the apartment that she had found for me. Thank God. because I didn't know anything about it. But they'd found an apartment for me in Westwood, which is basically right where the UCLA campus is, which is perfect for a 19-year-old because you can walk down and you don't need a car. I had no driver's license at the time. I was from New York. You didn't need a driver's license. Yeah, so I got there. It was right before Flashdance opened. I'm going to say it's like maybe April 10th, April 15th, mid-April 1983. I'm walking around Westwood and I just noticing all of these girls that are walking around. They all have these torn sweatshirts with their shoulders showing. And I'm like, what is this? Like, I don't get it at all. And then I finally see at the Mann Village, which is an iconic theater that's in Westwood, which literally, I believe, closed last week. The Village and the Bruin were the two big theaters that you would go to in Westwood. I walked up to the Mann Village and it says starting April 15th or 16th or whatever, Flashdance. And underneath it, it said, what a feeling. And of course, I was there for the first time in California. And I was like, yep, I can relate to that. What a feeling.
Landing into like a whole different movie industry, but also a massive music scene too. What were the comparisons like to New York? Did you embrace the whole Sunset Strip scene of like the mid to late 80s?
Well, you have to understand, I did Gremlins and then went straight back to New York. And I didn't move out to Los Angeles until the first week of September 1988. But I had been going out to LA a lot for auditions and stuff like that. So I would say the first time I noticed anything hair metal-y about Sunset Boulevard. There was a little bit of it in like 84, 85 because of Motley Crue's impact. But once Bon Jovi did Slippery When Wet in late 86, that album was so enormous. Even though they were from New Jersey, it doesn't matter. That really ignited it in a huge way. And then the next album after that, that lit the fuse. And then the atom bomb explosion was Def Leppard, Hysteria. Hysteria came out. And actually, ironically, most people forget this. The first single was Animal and it tanked. It was a disaster. And then the next single was Pour Some Sugar on Me or Love Bites. I think it was Pour Some Sugar on Me. And I mean, the summer of 1987, I can remember so well out there. It was the Def Leppard was everywhere. It was everywhere. I think Def Leppard's probably bigger in the United States than it was in England.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it was gargantuan. And then you just had all of the metal bands. Now MTV jumped on it. And, you know, you had Motley Crue would eventually come out with the Girls, Girls, Girls record, and then Dr. Feelgood. So really by 1988, 89, it was just a hair metal extravaganza. And I was living out there. So I would go up there. The thing, though, is like I never got accepted by any of those guys because, I mean, just look at me. I'm a preppy guy. I never had long hair.
Except in Waxwork too.
Except in the Waxwork too. I would not fit in there at all. Imagine this. Here's the thing. Deep down, I knew it was like a trendy thing. I knew it couldn't last. So I didn't want to be someone who's like, I'm going to completely change my appearance and look that way for 2 years and then have to change it back. And you also have to remember, by the time that metal got really huge, like 89, I'm 25. You know what I mean? I'm not 16. So I'm up there and I'm wearing like, you know, a button down and a blazer. And everybody's like, let's kick his ass, man. You know, they basically wanted to beat me up.
Did they see you as Billy from Gremlins, though, at that point?
Yeah, no, they definitely did. I definitely got recognized a lot. I think that saved me a lot of beatings. Also, I am, you know, close to 6 feet tall, so that kind of helps. And from New York, so it kind of prevents you from getting the shit kicked out of you.
Does your New York accent get thicker when someone gets a bit hostile?
It's weird. I think when you're a New Yorker, you learn not to be confrontational. You don't do things like make eye contact. You don't stare at the person. You know, you don't be like, what's up, dude? What you looking at? I've never been that guy because you do that in New York City, you get killed. Or you can get killed. So I was, you know, I like to think of myself as the friendly, like, hey, man, what's up? Hey, dude, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. And at that point, I was feeling pretty good about myself. By 89, I'm shooting Gremlins 2. You know, I'm dating really cute girls. Every time I would run into somebody who was a hair metal guy, they'd look at the girl I was with and be like, God damn, how do you get that? You know, so there was really not much violence there, you know, unless you were just super street thuggy.
Do you remember when Guns N' Roses blew up?
So I have a really good friend that I've been friends with for 40 years. His name is Josh Richmond, and he's actually on a Guns N' Roses track. He's on Knocking on Heaven's Door when the telephone rings, and it's like, you better stop your rank subjugation, Jack, because it's just you and me and the mortician together, whatever that rap is. That's him. So he was super great friends with Axl Rose. And this is one of my favorite rock and roll memories too. I have all sorts of memories, but most of them are movie memories, but I've got some great rock and roll memories too. So Josh, for whatever reason, he had a nice car. He had a Porsche, but he never liked to drive it. I guess he just didn't like driving. So he'd always try and get me to pick him up. So I got my first car ever when I learned to drive. Actually, this was a rental. I finally did get a convertible Beamer because I knew nothing about cars. I didn't know how yuppie it was. I just had a girlfriend who was like, this is the car you want. And I knew nothing about cars. So I was like, okay. But I was in a rental car because I had just learned to drive. And Josh goes, you want to hear something fucking crazy? And I go, yeah. He goes, listen to this. This band's going to be coming out in like a month. I'm not even going to say anything. Just listen to this. Put the cassette in the car radio. And he turned it up. And you hear, junkata, 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 junkata. Oh, into Welcome to the Jungle. Everyone's heard it a billion times now. But the first time that you heard that shit was so different. Axl was so different from everybody else. I was like, that first scream in Welcome to the Jungle, the hair rose up on the back of my neck. It was like a feral animal. When it was over, he looked at me and he goes, how's that shit? And I go, holy. And just because Josh has always been super close to people in the music business, he's like really good friends with Rick Rubin. So I've been fortunate enough through him, purely through him, not through me, to hear all sorts of stuff, sometimes months before it came out. Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, he played that for me like 3 months before it came out. It was all about that Super Unknown album with good reason. It's an incredible record. But every time Soundgarden would have some, I don't know how he was close to them. Maybe it was the producer. Isn't that Michael Beinhorn who produced Super Unknown? I think it is. So Josh always managed to be close to all of these bands somehow and know all the freaking cool people and would always have advanced cassettes, usually a couple of weeks, but even sometimes a couple of months before everybody else. I was constantly hearing all of this new shit before anybody else. And that's always fun when you're on the inside like that.
And then you would hear it on the radio like a couple of weeks later.
Yeah.
Because I found out you're a fan of the Wild Arts as well.
Oh, the Wild Hearts. Yeah, Ginger. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of the earlier Wild Hearts stuff I like. I like so many different types of music. I mean, I love power pop. I'm a huge power pop guy. I'm also a huge prog guy, but I also like some really pretty crushingly heavy metal. And people always get surprised when they're like, dude, you don't know Rust in Peace. I'm like, dude, I got Rust in Peace the first fucking day it came out and I played it nonstop. You know what you want to hear? You want to hear my Metallica story because my Metallica story is pretty funny. So I was late to Metallica and I went up to Tower Records. It's 1988. And the number one record, I'm looking at it. Tower Records used to have a thing where like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in little bins. The number one record is a Metallica record called And Justice for All. And I go, how is this fucking band so popular? I hadn't heard Ride Lightning, hadn't heard Master Puppets. None of that stuff got any airplay. The only thing that ever got airplay and put Metallica on the map for non-metal thrash heads like myself is One, the song One. That was like the first big breakthrough video for them. And they were also on the Grammys too. So I bought the cassette. I said, if it's number one, there's got to be something good to it. It can't be that popular and just be terrible. So I took it home and I was playing the Legend of Zelda video game. I put it on and I put on the first track is Blackened, right? And it goes, Blackened is the end. Blackened never ends. Cover yourself in it. Blackened. Thugga, 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 thugga. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, what the fuck? There's no bass.
I was just about to say there's no bass.
Because there's no bass. It sounds like somebody is like writing a song and recording it in like a buzzsaw factory or something like that. I'm like, this is garbage. And I pulled the thing out. I said, this sucks.
Back to Tower Records.
I pulled the thing out and my roommate at the time came home and he and I still crack up about this. He goes, hey, did you listen to the new Metallica record? And I go, yeah. And he goes, what do you think? And I went, it bites balls. Every now and then, 35 years later, he'll look at me, I'll ask him something and he'll go, it bites balls. So I put it down for like a day or two, but I didn't return it. And I went like this. I said, I've got to be missing something. I don't know what it is. I said, you know what? Even if it sucks, even if I hate it, I'm going to like it. I was just determined that I couldn't be missing something. There must be something there. So I put it in. I started playing Legend of Zelda. And I said, I'm going to listen to it 5 times through. And if I still hate it after 5 times through, I'll give up. And, and Justice for All is in some ways almost kind of a prog album because the time signatures and everything, it doesn't have any melodies really. Although when you hear one played on the piano, it actually has a beautiful melodic thing. So by the fourth time, I eventually found myself going, and I finally got it and I loved it. And then I went back and I got the entire catalog, starting with Kill 'Em All, and then I got Ride the Lightning, and then I got Puppets, and then Puppets blew my mind. And obviously I was the first online for the Black Album, but I was late to the Metallica party. But man, they didn't make it easy with Injustice for All, because that's a very, imagine if Saint Anger was your first record. It's a tough record to get into.
I've had this conversation with loads and loads of people, and it's a reflection of how music is today with like the instant stuff of Spotify and things. If you'd have been clicking on Spotify, you'd have never gone back to that album.
Never.
Because you brought it.
Yeah, it's true.
It's like, it's true. For this, I'm going to at least give it a few spins.
I would never have gone back to it. And that's what I actually just did. I don't know if you're like me, but when I get into something, I just do it. People say, what are you doing now? I'll be like, I'm in my Bob Dylan phase. I'm in my Leonard Cohen phase. I'm in my Zeppelin phase, in which I start at the beginning. I do the entire freaking catalog. I even did it with Frank Zappa, who's got like 90 fucking records. My Zappa phase took me something like 11 months. It was insane. It's a very obsessive type thing. So luckily, Deftones only has 9 records, but I am just at the very tail end of my Deftones phase. But that's because I listened to White Pony and everyone was like, White Pony, White Pony. But I didn't really get it the first time. It wasn't what I was expecting. I didn't really get it. Ironically, I tried this time, like a month ago to give it another try. And I still don't like it nearly as much as I like Diamond Eyes, which I think is a fucking masterpiece. That's one of the best metal records ever. Diamond Eyes is like flawless from beginning to end.
I need to do a Zach Galligan dive on the Deftones because I've never got it. I'm like you with Metallica. I'm like, nah, never got it.
Listen to Diamond Eyes 3 times in a row or 4 times in a row. And if you don't get it then...
I'm going back to listening to Poison.
Yeah. It's weird. It's because what's unexpected about it is it's super heavy, but you know how like Nirvana goes from like soft to super heavy and soft to super heavy? What Deftones does is they go from super heavy to dream pop to like shoegaze to like floaty. And Chino Moreno's voice is super floaty. So it's weird. They alternate. They don't go soft loud. They go hard float. And it takes you a while to get used to it, but once you do,
you're in.
It's great. Whether it's a super hard song like Rocket Skates, which is on Diamond Eyes, or a super floaty song like Sex Tape. One of the things about Deftones, the only negative thing I have to say about Deftones is some of their titles of the songs. I don't really know what they were going for with this because it's like kind of a dodgy title, does not really reflect the song particularly. So like if you play a song like Sex Tape, it sounds like it's going to be kind of sleazy and it's absolute gloriously beautiful ballad, basically.
It's the polar opposite.
It's almost like they don't want you to listen to the song by calling it that, especially when there's so many beautiful lyrics in the song. They could have called it Waves Collide, which is much closer to what the song sounds like than Sex Tape.
Zach, if it's all right, I want you to time travel a little to a Friday night in the late 80s or early 90s, and you head into the local video store. What movie soundtrack would you have on the Walkman, and what 3 tapes would you rent for the weekend?
I had a store across the street from where I lived called the Video Vault. I would do that, do VHS. And then out in Los Angeles, I think it was Record Warehouse is where I went to. That was a chain we had that had videos. Give me a year.
I don't know. Let's go 89 then.
89.
So that means you can have something from prior to 89.
Prior to 89. Yeah. So let's see. What tapes would I rent in the late 80s? Well, probably I'd rent something like Dead Ringers, the David Cronenberg movie. That's a good one. What else was good in 88 or 89? It's weird because those 2 years are not as good as the early to mid 80s.
Well, 84, like Gremlins and Ghostbusters year, they're just 2 of many. It's crazy.
Yeah. Even 82 is great too, with Blade Runner and The Thing in it. By 89, it's like I was so busy doing Gremlins 2 for 6 months out of the year. That year is a bit of a blur for me. At least half of it is.
That's a big cinema year for like Batman and stuff like that.
Yeah, Batman, that's right. And you had Prince doing the soundtrack. Definitely had that in my car for sure.
Yes, that was huge.
Yeah, that was an enormous, just ginormous film. I don't know, late 80s, I wasn't really all about soundtracks as much as I was, I was fully into the rock and roll thing. I did this movie called Mortal Passions, and the guy who played my brother was an actor named Michael Bowen. If you look him up, he's in a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies and Breaking Bad. He was outside in his car and he was listening to Highway to Hell by AC/DC. This is really funny too. This is another rock and roll turning point for me. And he was playing a track from it. I think it was Night Prowler, and he was cranking it in his car. And you got to understand, like I said, I was a preppy kid. I grew up with my sister, was my older sister. So I'm listening to like Jackson Browne and James Taylor. The heaviest I got was like Zeppelin. Black Sabbath, I thought was terrible. You know what I mean? Like this was a big change for me. And he was playing the Night Prowler. And I looked at him in the car, and I'll never forget this. I looked at him and I said, "You listen to this?" And he looked up at me and he goes, "Yeah, man, it's rock and roll." And I went like this. It was the way he said it was such simplicity. I went like this. Somehow, the way he said it gave me permission to like other types of music that at that point, as a 25-year-old, I thought, that's not my identity. I can't like that, you know? And when you're young, you think ridiculous things like that. You think things like, well, I'm a metalhead. I can only listen to metal. I can't listen to Joni Mitchell. And it's not until you get older, you realize like, dude, you can listen to anything you want. You can listen to Metallica, then you can listen to Barbra Streisand if you fucking want. It makes no difference. You can listen to Mozart, and then you can listen to Count Basie, and then you can listen to Stravinsky, and then you can listen to Nirvana, and then you can listen to Taylor Swift. And it's all perfectly fine, dude. It's just music. But you know, back then, people were very sort of like almost segregated. I'm a folk singer-songwriter person. I'm a metalhead. I'm a psychedelic person. It's like, no, dude, you can listen to anything you want. It's all good. And so I really started questioning my taste in rock and roll. And one of the first things I did when I did Gremlins 2 was I went to the Warner Brothers commissary where you could get huge discounts on tapes and got the entire Black Sabbath catalog with Ozzy. And I was like, oh my God, Black Sabbath 4 is like, still, Black Sabbath 4 is probably in my top 20 albums of all time. Brilliant.
Superb. Zach, I'll let you go, but thank you so much for all the stories. I could keep on going, but I appreciate your time, and I appreciate Dom hooking us up. It's very cool of him.
Hey man, I'm your 300th guest. You know, I had to bring the stories and throw down.
Massive thank you to Zach Galligan for chatting with me on this big episode for my Straight to Video podcast. So great to hear such cool and unique stories from his amazing journey, and I can't wait to discover even more when his book is released. You can follow what Zach is up to over on Instagram at ZWGman or ZWGman if you're in the US. And if you've enjoyed this talk or any other of the previous STV podcasts, please consider giving the show a share or review on whatever social media you use. So after hitting this big number of episodes, I've decided to hopefully pivot a little with the show. I don't think you'll be seeing the regular Friday release schedule, but the podcast is without doubt going to continue, but there might be a bit of a revamp or makeover along the way, which I think is going to be pretty exciting and keep things fresh. So please keep your eyes and obviously ears peeled for what happens next, and I promise to always make it cool for you. So that is all for this milestone, episode 300 of the podcast. I'm super grateful for you for being on this ride with me and tuning in to listen. So until the next one, please make sure to always be kind, please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.